New hope for the last endangered wild horse species in the world. The horses became extinct in the wild in the 1960s.
They vanished from the wild for over 30 years, extinct, erased, forgotten.
We told you how wild horses have been introduced to Kent to help with the countryside, and we've been watching them ever since.
Then, against all odds, a herd was loaded onto planes and released into one of the most brutal deserts on Earth. No fences, no second chances. What followed wasn't just survival, it cracked open old myths about what wild really means. As biologists tracked their every move, something unexpected began to unfold, not just in the sand, but in the science. Could instincts buried for generations resurface? Could DNA hide a truth that challenges everything we thought we knew? One thing was clear, this wasn't just a conservation story. It was a test of nature, of memory, of how far we can push the idea of bringing something back. The last wild horse. Przewalski's horse, once widespread across the steppes of Central Asia, saw its numbers collapse in the 20th century due to intense human pressures. Overhunting for meat and pelts, habitat degradation from overgrazing, military activity, and increasing competition with livestock pushed the species into retreat. As grasslands were fragmented and water sources dried up due to drilling and climate shifts, the horses lost the very resources they relied on for survival. By the mid-20th century, sightings had become so rare that their disappearance from the wild drew little immediate attention. The last confirmed sighting of a wild Przewalski's horse came in 1969 when a Mongolian border patrol reportedly spotted a lone stallion before it vanished into the horizon. That quiet moment marked the species' official classification as extinct in the wild. Despite their deep evolutionary roots, dating back more than 60 million years, they had become confined to captivity. For a species once embedded in Central Asian lore and culture, their disappearance symbolized not just a biological loss, but the fading of a unique ecological presence. Przewalski's horses are built for survival: short, muscular bodies, erect manes, and stocky legs adapted for traversing arid plains. Unlike domestic horses, they were never truly tamed. These differences were once dismissed as quirks, but they held ecological significance. As mixed grazers, they played an important role in shaping grassland dynamics, influencing plant growth through light grazing and seed dispersal. They also served as prey for wolves, linking them to a broader food web that included top predators and desert flora. Without them, steppe ecosystems lost one of their key natural regulators. Today, with more than 2,000 Przewalski's horses globally, including over 700 in China alone, there is cautious optimism. But their past remains a cautionary tale. Every individual alive today descends from a limited pool of around 12 to 15 founders, a legacy of near eradication. Even with technological tools and coordinated conservation, the species remains genetically vulnerable. Could a single outbreak or environmental collapse threaten decades of recovery? That question still looms, a reminder of how close these animals came to vanishing entirely, and how delicate their return continues to be. What if the only hope for a vanished species came not from the wild, but from behind zoo fences? The global breeding lifeline. When Przewalski's horses were declared extinct in the wild in 1969, only a handful survived in captivity. Just 12 to 15 genetically distinct individuals, 5 stallions and 7 to 10 mares, became the last thread connecting the species to the future. These few survivors had been collected over decades, often from traveling circuses and European menageries, where they were treated more as curiosities than conservation subjects. With such a narrow genetic base, many biologists believed recovery was unlikely, fearing inbreeding would doom any long-term survival plans. Instead, the opposite happened. Starting in the 1950s, a rare wave of international cooperation took shape. Zoos across Europe and North America, often competitors, began coordinated breeding efforts. In 1959, the International Stud Book for Przewalski's horses was created. More than just a registry, it became a carefully managed system to track ancestry, avoid inbreeding, and match breeding pairs across institutions. Horses were flown across continents to diversify bloodlines, forming a living genetic reserve with meticulous oversight. By the 1980s, the captive population had reached over 1,000 individuals, held in facilities from Germany to the US. This success wasn't accidental. It was built on decades of deliberate breeding decisions and scientific record-keeping. China's involvement began in 1985 when it launched the Wild Horse Returning Home Project. The program started with imports from zoos in the UK, Germany, and the US, gradually building up China's own captive breeding centers in Xinjiang's Jimsar County and Gansu's Wuwei City. The goal was not just to house horses, but to prepare them for future release into the wild. Even today, all Przewalski's horses alive trace their ancestry back to that original group of founders. This reality still raises difficult questions. How do you maintain genetic health in a population with such limited origins? And as global efforts to expand wild herds continue, are the techniques used decades ago enough to sustain the species through new threats, climate shifts, disease, or habitat competition? While genetic technology has advanced dramatically, the foundation of this story remains the same: the survival of a species made possible not by a single breakthrough, but by sustained collective effort across countries and decades. China's wild gamble. When China decided to reintroduce Przewalski's horses into the wild, the choice of location surprised many. Rather than selecting grasslands similar to the horse's historic range, Chinese scientists opted for a harsh, arid stretch of the Yungar Basin, the Kalamaili Nature Reserve in Xinjiang. With temperature extremes ranging from over 40 degrees Celsius in summer to below 30 degrees Celsius in winter, and annual rainfall barely exceeding a coffee cup's worth, the reserve didn't seem ideal on paper. But it was precisely those extremes that made it the preferred testing ground. For a species to truly return to the wild, it needed more than safety, it needed challenge. The reasoning behind this decision was ecological rather than sentimental. Kalamaili was already home to wild ungulates like the Mongolian wild ass, Kulan, which had survived desert life without human aid. Releasing Przewalski's horses here meant forcing them to adapt, not just survive. If they could navigate this environment, their chances of developing true independence would increase dramatically. It also ensured that any observed survival would be real, not the result of over-managed conditions. Unlike fenced pastures, this was a place where the horses would have to rediscover their instincts. Establishing the infrastructure to support this gamble took years. In the early stages, China set up 2 dedicated breeding centers, one in Jimsar County and the other in Gansu's Wuwei City. These centers were tasked with preparing captive horses for eventual release, building up population numbers, conditioning them to local vegetation, and ensuring health standards were met. From 1985 to 2005, horses from zoos in Germany, the UK, and the US were flown in, some in padded crates aboard heavy cargo planes. Quarantine and health screening protocols were put in place. But these facilities were not the end goal. They were stepping stones. By 2001, with enough individuals bred and conditioned, the first group of 27 horses was transferred to Kalamaili. Many conservationists saw it as a high-risk move. Could animals born in zoos adjust to a desert where water was scarce and predators roamed freely? Would the rugged terrain break them or force evolution back into motion? These questions loomed large, yet despite the doubt, China stuck to its plan. The idea wasn't just to protect the species, it was to prove it could once again earn its place in the wild without a fence in sight. Behavioral conditioning before release. Preparing captive-born Przewalski's horses for life in one of the world's harshest deserts required more than just physical health. It demanded behavioral transformation. Horses raised in breeding centers were protected, regularly fed, and sheltered. Releasing them into the unforgiving terrain of Kalamili without survival instincts would have set them up for failure. So, scientists and handlers developed a unique set of pre-release training techniques designed to reawaken the instincts the species had once relied on. This effort focused not on taming, but on carefully undoing the effects of captivity. One method involved simulating natural threats. Trainers scattered wolf scat along the fence lines and occasionally brought in muzzled wolves on leashes to pace the enclosures. These drills were repeated until the horses reacted with the appropriate flight response, alert but not panicked. The goal wasn't to traumatize them, but to slowly build a healthy fear of predators. Over time, the horses became quicker to notice danger and more efficient at regrouping. These observations were carefully documented and helped determine which individuals were mentally prepared for reintroduction. Feeding was also restructured to mimic conditions in the wild. Rather than hand-delivering hay, keepers began tossing native grasses like feathergrass across the training enclosures to encourage foraging behavior. The horses had to search for food on uneven ground, learning to differentiate edible plants from those that would offer little nutrition. In addition, water sources were spaced apart to train endurance and navigation. These changes were essential in developing horses that wouldn't wait for human provision once they were released into open terrain. Perhaps the most overlooked but critical component was human desensitization. Caretakers wore neutral coveralls, avoided eye contact, and minimized vocal interaction. This prevented horses from associating people with safety or support. Horses that were too dependent on human presence were held back from release. There was even a specialized exercise known as boxing, where horses were gradually trained to enter and exit transport crates calmly. This process reduced stress during long-distance moves and minimized injury. Overall, this training framework ensured that released horses weren't just healthy, but ready. Still, it leaves one to wonder, can instincts fully return after generations in captivity? Or are some lessons lost forever? That question continues to shape how future generations are prepared for the wild. The moment instinct took over. On the morning of August 27, 2001, the gate at the Kalamaili Nature Reserve quietly opened. There were no tranquilizers, no herding poles, and no drones tracking every movement. Just 27 Przewalski's horses facing the desert for the first time. These animals, born in captivity and trained for months to shed dependence on humans, stood at the edge of an environment that would now test every behavioral instinct embedded in their DNA. The group included 11 mares, 9 stallions, and 7 foals. With no clear signal, the lead stallion stepped forward, sniffed the air, and broke into a trot. The rest followed. Within seconds, they disappeared over a ridge into silence. No immediate effort was made to pursue or monitor them. The goal wasn't to control the animals, but to observe how they adapted independently. It wasn't until 3 days later that scientists managed to relocate the group. Using aerial surveys from a rented Y-12 turboprop aircraft, they picked up faint signals from radio collars 60 kilometers southeast of the release site. What shocked researchers wasn't just that the herd had moved so far so quickly, but that they had located an uncharted spring, one not previously mapped by reserve staff. Without prior experience in this terrain, the horses had found water on their own. This unplanned sighs stunned field biologists. How could animals raised under human supervision and released with no direct guidance locate such a resource in one of Asia's driest regions within 72 hours. Was it instinct, learned behavior from training, or something else entirely? Some speculated that ancestral memory encoded in their evolution might have played a role. While there's no definitive answer, the event reinforced a core idea of the rewilding project. Instinct, even after generations in captivity, may not be as lost as once feared. What followed over the next several weeks only strengthened this view. The horses began forming distinct bands. Young males split off into bachelor groups, while mature stallions began to assert dominance of either mares. Just 9 weeks after their release, rangers observed the first documented stallion challenge, an interaction marked by ritual squeals and posturing, but no injuries. It was a signal that social structures, essential for long-term herd stability, were emerging without human instruction. For many watching the project, this moment, Release 0, was more than a field experiment. It was living proof that a species, once declared extinct in the wild, could still choose survival on its own terms. Just when the horses seemed to be finding their rhythm, they encountered neighbors with their own rules, coexisting with kulan and wolves. Once released into the unforgiving Kalameli Desert, the Przewalski's horses entered an ecosystem already inhabited by other desert-adapted species, particularly the Mongolian wild ass, or kulan, and the elusive gray wolf. These resident species were not just passive background characters, they were potential competitors and predators. Conservationists had legitimate concerns about how the newly reintroduced horses would fit into this existing web of survival. Would they clash with kulans over limited water resources? Would wolves target them disproportionately, threatening herd stability? What unfolded was far more nuanced and unexpectedly cooperative. Camera-trapped data and infrared surveillance provided the first clues. At watering holes, scarce and scattered across vast stretches of desert, horses were observed waiting while kulan drank first. This pattern repeated often enough to suggest it wasn't coincidence. Biologists describe this as a form of emergent etiquette, a behavior not taught or enforced, but formed under pressure. By yielding priority at shared resources, the horses avoided unnecessary conflict with faster, more agile kulans. The payoff was mutual access and reduced risk of injury. This type of nonverbal negotiation hadn't been anticipated, and it challenged traditional expectations of competition between similar species. Predators added another layer of complexity. Drone surveys in 2021 identified 14 gray wolves operating within the reserve. These weren't zoo animals or staged threats, they were active hunters, but their hunting patterns didn't appear indiscriminate. Instead of targeting foals or mares, wolves focused on bachelor stallions, typically younger, solitary males on the edge of herds. Field researchers recorded at least 3 confirmed wolf kills during the first winter. While harsh, this dynamic mirrored natural predation models from Mongolia, where wild horse populations have historically coexisted with wolves. Predation, in this context, wasn't just tolerated, it was considered a signal of ecological balance. The interactions between Przewalski's horses, kulans, and wolves may seem like background noise to the broader rewilding story, but they reveal something deeper: adaptation through behavior. These horses, having been removed from natural systems for decades, were not just surviving, they were adjusting to the rules of the land in real time. No human interference, no micromanaged cohabitation plans, just instinct, observation, and consequence. Could this level of adaptability influence how we design future rewilding projects for other species? That question lingers, especially as biologists continue to study how nonverbal negotiations in wild spaces shape long-term survival. The gene bank that breathes. Behind the successful rewilding of Przewalski's horses lies a critical, less visible component: genetic management. Every horse alive today descends from a small founder pool of just 12 to 15 individuals, making the population especially vulnerable to inbreeding. To address this, Chinese conservationists didn't just focus on numbers. They built a living, breathing gene bank in Jimsar County, Xinjiang. Unlike frozen tissue repositories, this gene bank is made of actual, roaming animals whose movements and matings are carefully tracked, controlled, and, when necessary, restructured to maintain genetic health. The core strategy involves rotational herd management. The Jimsar Breeding Center is divided into multiple satellite enclosures arranged around a central facility. Each year, stallions and mares are rotated between these pastures in a clockwise pattern. This mimics natural dispersal patterns seen in the wild, where young horses leave their birth bands to avoid mating with close relatives. Adults are sedated and transported using flatbed trucks during the spring, minimizing stress and injury. By ensuring constant mixing of bloodlines, the program reduces the risk of genetic stagnation, a serious concern for species with such narrow ancestry. To support this rotation system, an advanced genetic monitoring platform was introduced. This cloud-based software functions like a matchmaking tool, jokingly referred to by staff as horse Tinder. Every foal's umbilical cord is sampled at birth and logged into a national DNA database, which is cross-referenced with the International Stud Book dating back to 1959. The program calculates inbreeding coefficients and flags problematic pairings. Green indicators mean a match is safe, while red flags indicate high overlap. Paired with high-resolution photos and diversity scores, the system allows researchers to make data-informed decisions in real time. Since implementing these tools in 2015, China has reduced the inbreeding coefficient of its herds from 0.125 to under 0.228, a 40% drop. This is a significant achievement for a species with such limited genetic origins. But it also raises broader questions. Should this level of intervention be a permanent feature of conservation, or just a transitional tool? As rewilded populations grow and stabilize, scientists hope to reduce artificial involvement. Still, until wild populations become self-sustaining and resilient to disease and climate stress, the gene bank remains the invisible backbone of the species' comeback, an unusual but necessary merger of biology and data science. Unexpected environmental benefits. When conservationists released Przewalski's horses into China's Kalamyli Desert, their primary concern was survival. But over time, a second unexpected benefit emerged: ecological restoration. Far from damaging the fragile desert environment, the rewilded horses began to play an active role in its recovery. Their light but consistent grazing helped regulate plant growth and counteract the dominance of hardy shrubs that typically overtake arid lands when left unchecked. This grazing pattern, unlike the intensive foraging behavior of livestock, allowed more diverse plant species to regenerate and persist. Field surveys and grass plot monitoring provided clear evidence. Areas grazed by Przewalski's horses showed deeper root systems and more robust coverage of native grasses such as feathergrass and stipa species. These grasses are critical for anchoring soil and reducing wind erosion, two major challenges in desertified zones. In contrast, sections of the reserve that had been fenced off from grazing began to show signs of ecological decline. Shrubs like Artemisia grew unchecked, crowding out native flora and reducing habitat variety for other wildlife. Inadvertently, the horses were restoring ecological balance simply by doing what they had evolved to do. This role as ecosystem engineers mirrors similar patterns seen with other reintroduced large herbivores, like bison in North America or elephants in parts of Africa. Yet, in the case of Przewalski's horses, the outcome was particularly striking because of the extreme environment they were placed in. With fewer than 30 grazable plant species available, every grazing pattern mattered. The horses' selective browsing helped promote tillering, where grasses send out new shoots, allowing more plant biomass to develop and stabilize the sandy soils beneath. This process, though subtle, plays a crucial role in reversing desertification. These results have sparked new conversations among ecologists. Could reintroducing historically native herbivores offer a low-impact alternative to mechanical desert restoration methods? And if so, could similar models be replicated in other parts of Asia, suffering from land degradation? While long-term studies are still ongoing, the early outcomes suggest the Przewalski's horses aren't just surviving the desert. They're helping heal it. Their presence has shifted the reserve from a passive conservation zone into a functioning, dynamic ecosystem, driven not by intervention, but by natural behavior. It's a reminder that sometimes the best solution to environmental decline is not to introduce something new, but to bring something old back home. Project 3 Stars and National Expansion. After the initial success at Kalamaili, China launched a broader initiative to expand the rewilding of Przewalski's horses across multiple regions. This effort, known as Project 3 Stars, aimed to establish viable wild populations not just in Xinjiang, but also in the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, the semi-arid plateaus of Gansu, and the high-altitude terrain of Qinghai. Each site was selected for its unique environmental conditions, allowing researchers to observe how the horses adapt across diverse ecosystems. The goal was not uniformity, but resilience, testing whether Przewalski's horses could survive and eventually thrive under different ecological pressures. The results have shown intriguing regional differences. In Inner Mongolia, where summer pastures are more abundant, herds tend to grow faster and form tighter social structures. In contrast, horses in Qinghai face colder temperatures and steeper elevations, prompting more frequent seasonal migrations. Gansu, with its transitional grass desert zones, has emerged as a behavioral middle ground. These regional distinctions are helping researchers refine management strategies, such as adjusting breeding seasons or water provisioning, based on site-specific data. The horse's ability to modify behavior based on local terrain has given conservationists greater confidence in long-term rewilding scalability. Technological innovations have played a key role in supporting this expansion. One example is the use of snow belts, fabric windbreaks stretched across ridgelines to reduce heat loss, and drifting snow in harsh winter months. These simple but effective structures give herds temporary shelter during critical periods without fully enclosing or domesticating their habitat. Additionally, a pilot program in Qinghai has tested railway-based mobile stables, designed to transport horses between grazing zones and breeding stations without using stress-inducing trailers. These custom cars mimic open-air enclosures and are already being considered for broader use in future translocations. While Project 3 Stars remains in a growth phase, it represents a major shift in how China approaches species recovery. Instead of focusing on a single reserve, the effort now treats wild horses as part of a mobile, adaptable population network. Could this become a model for other endangered species, using geographic diversity as a defense against localized collapse? That question remains open. But what's already clear is that rewilding, once seen as a one-site experiment, is evolving into a nationwide strategy. And with each new site, Przewalski's horses are not just returning to the wild, they are redefining what it means to belong there. One emerging challenge with multi-site expansion is maintaining behavioral cohesion across herds that rarely, if ever, interact. Horses released in Inner Mongolia may never encounter those from Qinghai, leading to slight but notable divergences in herd dynamics, predator response, and foraging strategies. To address this, researchers have begun cross-regional monitoring using GPS-tagged individuals and shared behavioral data sets. The aim is to identify patterns that could inform a new kind of cultural mapping for wild horses, tracking not just genetics but learned behavior shaped by landscape and herd experience. This approach may help predict how future populations will evolve in response to local pressures, and whether regional behavioral drift could eventually impact breeding or adaptability. There's also a logistical layer to this nationwide effort, balancing rewilding goals with infrastructure, human settlement, and land use politics. In regions like Gansu and Qinghai, where herders and horses now share overlapping terrain, conservation teams have had to navigate delicate negotiations. Memorandums of understanding with local communities include grazing boundary agreements, seasonal buffer zones, and wildlife compensation policies for crop or resource disruptions. These agreements are not just legal tools. They represent a growing acknowledgement that species recovery can't exist in isolation. Long-term success will depend not only on the horse's resilience, but on how well human systems are integrated into the rewilding equation. As wild herds expanded across China, a quiet genetic discovery threatened to rewrite the story's core: genetic revelations. For over a century, Przewalski's horses were thought to be the last truly wild horse species, never domesticated, untouched by humans. But recent genomic studies have disrupted that narrative. Researchers comparing ancient DNA from archaeological horse remains with modern Przewalski's horses have concluded that these animals are actually feral descendants of horses once domesticated at the Botai culture site in what is now Kazakhstan over 5,000 years ago. This finding doesn't negate their wild behavior today, but it does challenge long-held assumptions about what wild means in conservation. This revelation has practical implications. If the species is technically feral, does that change its conservation value? Many scientists say no. In fact, it may highlight a broader truth. Behavior and ecological function often matter more than lineage. Przewalski's horses still behave like wild animals, form social bands, avoid human contact, and play key roles in grassland dynamics. They fill an ecological niche that would otherwise remain vacant. In that sense, their role in the ecosystem is arguably more important than their genetic purity. Conservation efforts, then, may need to prioritize function over myth. Meanwhile, genetic technology continues to reshape how we approach species recovery. Cloning discussions, once relegated to science fiction, have entered real conservation dialogues. Could we use preserved DNA from early 20th century specimens to increase genetic diversity? Or even reintroduce now-lost traits? Efforts like cryogenic tissue storage and somatic cell banks are already in place. However, ethical and ecological questions remain. Would cloned individuals behave like wild horses, or would something essential be missing? And how would they integrate into existing social structures? These are not just scientific puzzles, but philosophical ones as well. Finally, international gene-sharing initiatives are gaining momentum. China, Mongolia, and European countries are exploring ways to exchange breeding individuals or gametes to widen genetic diversity. These collaborations could become essential safeguards against future disease outbreaks or climate-related collapses. But with shifting definitions of wild, will international policies adapt fast enough? And as we manipulate genetics more directly, at what point does rewilding risk becoming manufactured wilderness? These unresolved questions reflect a broader shift in conservation, one that no longer simply protects what was, but actively designs what might be. The Przewalski's horse, once a symbol of extinction, now stands at the center of that debate. Efforts to preserve and enhance the genetic future of Przewalski's horses are now leveraging tools once reserved for cutting-edge human medicine. Whole genome sequencing has allowed scientists to identify specific bottlenecks in the species' genetic history, offering insight into which bloodlines carry the most unique, or underrepresented traits. In China, biobanks are being expanded to store viable reproductive material, not just from living horses, but also from long-deceased individuals whose preserved tissue samples remain viable through cryopreservation. These resources are already being used to plan future breeding cycles that aim to retain rare alleles, a strategy that may prove critical if sudden disease or environmental pressures demand rapid adaptation. Yet even with these advances, one of the greatest uncertainties lies in how far we should go. Introducing cloned or gene-edited horses into an already vulnerable wild population could carry unforeseen risks, behavioral mismatches, social rejection, or even destabilized herd dynamics. Conservationists are walking a fine line between restoring genetic diversity and preserving the natural behaviors that have made the species return to the wild so successful. In this emerging era of engineered wildness, the Przewalski's horse is no longer just a case study in survival. It's a test bed for what the future of conservation may look like, where biology, ethics, and technology converge in real time. If that left you thinking differently about extinction and wildness, you're not alone. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, especially what surprised you most. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you're ready for another wild twist in nature's story, check out the next video on your screen. It gets even stranger.